In this video, we are going to look at places in Kenya and streets that had European names or British names, but then those names were changed after independence. Some of them were changed, some were not. We are going to look at that. I'm going to start with towns, and then we look at streets in Nairobi. The major streets, Moi Avenue, Tom Mboya, Haile Selassie, all those streets had European names before independence, and after independence, those names changed to what we know them today. And I'm also going to look some places that have corrupted names. Now, these are names that were British or English names, but the locals corrupted them and started pronouncing them in a certain way, and the corrupted names stuck. Now, let's start with towns. Now, with towns, I'll start with Fort Smith. Now, Fort Smith is Kikuyu. Kikuyu was given the name Fort Smith by the Europeans, and throughout colonial time, it was known as Fort Smith. Now, after independence, that's when the name Kikuyu came in. Now, Smith, turns out, was some European, of course, officer. One Major Eric E. A. Smith, he was a British officer, and seems like he worked with the Imperial British East Africa Company. And he's the one who established that town, or he founded the fort at the town, and it was called Fort Smith. Now, Fort Smith, of course, later on was changed. The name was changed to, of course, Kikuyu Town. Today we know it as Kikuyu Town. Now, the second one is Fort Hall. Now, Fort Hall is Murang'a. Of course, it's one of the most popular towns that had British names. It was Fort Hall, and then after independence, the name was changed to Murang'a. In the East Africa Protectorate by Sir Charles Eliot or Kulbi C.W. Hoblays, he mentions meeting someone who was the person named after, whose name was given to Murang'a. And he was also, he was a British colonial administrator. And in fact, initially he was stationed at Fort Smith at Kikuyu. And then he was taken to Murang'a, and he started the Murang'a town, and it was named after him, Fort Hall. His name was Francis George Hall. He was a colonial administrator, and the name, of course, later on was changed to Murang'a. Today we know the town as Murang'a. Now, the third town is Port Florence. Now, Port Florence is the town we know today as Kisumu. Now, Port Florence was named, interestingly, after a wife of a senior or chief engineer who was working on the railway. The Mombasa-Uganda railway is called the Uganda Railway, even though the much of it is in Kenya. Now, this guy went by the name Ronald Preston. His wife was Florence Preston, and they decided to name that port as Port Florence after his wife. Very interesting. But of course, that name was, of course, later on changed to Kisumu. Now, the fourth is Lake Rudolph. Now, Lake Rudolph is not named after a British. This is very interesting. Lake Rudolph was named after Archduke Rudolph of Austria-Hungary during those times. And he was the son of Emperor Franz Joseph I. The person who named the Lake Rudolph was an explorer who went by the name Samuel Teleki de Zek. This is a very, we could say, very well-known guy when it comes to the history of East Africa and the Horn of Africa in general. He's the one who arrived at the lake and decided to give it the name Lake Rudolph. Now, interestingly, when the British made Kenya a colony or a protectorate initially, they decided to let that name stick or remain to be Lake Rudolph. Of course, Lake Rudolph was later on changed to become Lake Turkana. Today, we know it as Lake Turkana. Now, let's come to Nairobi, the streets of Nairobi. Today, this Kenyatta Avenue, Moi Avenue, Kimathi Street, Tom Mboya, all these are names that if you are a resident of Nairobi, Koinange, University Way, Biashara, Haile Selassie, these are like burned in our memory, especially if you've lived in Nairobi. But interestingly, these names were not the names of these streets up until independence. Before independence, they were called other names. And let's look at some of these names. Now, let's start with Kenyatta Avenue. Of course, Kenyatta Avenue is named after Jomo Kenyatta. I'm assuming maybe it could be one of the Kenyattas, but for sure, it must be Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya. Now, this road used to be known as the Delemere Avenue. Now, of course, Delemere is a prominent name in Kenya, colonial Kenya. The Delemere family, they're still around, they do farming. It was a huge family. The Lord Delemere, of course. It was named after the Lord Delemere, who was a settler leader. And Lord Elemi is mentioned a lot in the old colonial documents as seeming to have had a lot of influence in the colony. And he seemed to have prevented very many things from happening. For example, the establishment of the State of Israel in Kenya, a very well-known story. He's among those who really opposed it. So the road was named Lord Delemere Avenue. And after independence, Jomo Kenyatta decided, you know what, that road needs to be named after me. And it became the Kenyatta Avenue. Now, there is the Moi Avenue. Of course, Moi was the second president of Kenya. That road used to be known as Government Road. Now, Government Road, of course, was just Government Road, not named for after any particular British. It was just Government Road. And when Kenya became independence, could be maybe a little bit later, it was named after Moi. It became the Moi Avenue. Now, Kimathi Street. Kimathi Street, of course, today is named after the Mau Mau leader, Dedan Kimathi. But of course, there is no way it was going to be Dedan Kimathi before independence. Remember that Dedan Kimathi was one of, we could say, the most feared enemy of the British colonial government. So there is no way it was going to be Dedan Kimathi during that time. Before independence, it used to be called Hardinge Street. It was named after Sir Arthur Hardinge. Seems like he was a diplomat, and then at some point he was sent to East Africa, initially as a diplomat to Zanzibar, but then later on he became to the East Africa Protectorate, and he somehow oversaw the construction of the railway line from, of course, Mombasa to Uganda, the Uganda railway line as it is called. It doesn't seem like he settled in Kenya that much, but he had some links to this country, and a road was named after him, Antije Street, which of course later on was given the name Kimathi Street. The next street is Tomboya Street. Now, Tomboya Street, of course, today is named after Tomboya, who was among the very first ministers in the independent Kenya. And the road used to be called Victoria Street. And Victoria Street, of course, you might guess it was named after Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria ruled Britain maybe late 19th century, early 20th century, and they named that road after her. And then after Kenya became independent, it was named after Tomboya. Now, the next one is Koinange Street. Now, Koinange Street is named, of course, after Chief Koinange. And Chief Koinange was a chief during colonial times. And I think he has some relationships with the Kenyatta family. And after independence, that road was named after him. But before independence, the road used to be called the Sadler Street. And the Sadler Street was named after James Hayes Sadler. Seems like he was a commissioner, meaning he was in the colonial administration. And yes, now the other one is University Way. University Way used to be called Kingsway. And of course, Kingsway is not really a name of someone, just seems like it was recognizing the monarch. So it was called the Kingsway. Then after independence, they got the name University Way. There is Bazaar Street, um, which became Biashara Street. Bazaar Street is just a bazaar, I think. There is no other name or other meaning. They just turn it to Biashara Street. Then there is the Haile Selassie Avenue. Haile Selassie is named after Emperor Haile Selassie, the last emperor of the Ethiopian or Abyssinian Empire. And of course, that name was given to that road after independence as an honor to Haile Selassie. Of course, Haile Selassie was a huge friend of Jomo Kenyatta, I understand. And it used to be called the White House Road. Now, it was named after George Whitehouse, who was a railway engineer. He participated in the construction of the railway, I guess, and they named that road after him, especially considering it's just next to the railway head office. It used to be, I think, the head office of railway. Maybe it still is. Now, let's look at names that still exist. They are English names, but they were corrupted. There is Dagoretti, Dagoretti Corner. Everybody in Nairobi knows Dagoretti Corner. It used to be the Great Corner. And there is the Rumuruti in Laikipia. Now, Rumuruti used to be remote route. And there is the Royal Suburbs, which is Roysambu today, an estate that is very well known, Roysambu. There is the Career Corps, Kariako. This was like I think residence of could be of military guys sort of during colonial times. There is the Kirigiti, the Kirigiti Stadium in Kiambu, this cricket field, and the people corrupted it to be Kirigiti. When I was reading C.W. Hoblays, there is a mention of a town that would have likely been the headquarters of Kenya, the capital, in around Londiani somewhere. I think it was going to be called Edwardstown, something of that kind. I saw something like that. But that was just a suggestion. Very early on, could be in 1890s, there was that suggestion of building a town around Londiani as they were constructing the railway, and then call it, I think, Edwardstown. But that never materialized, and Nairobi remained to be the capital of the protectorate and the colony and then independent Kenya.